Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our first live office hour for the self-paced MOOC on environmental security and sustaining peace. I'm Carl Brook. I direct international programs at the Environmental Law Institute, and I'm one of the core faculty for the course. I'm here with David Jensen. David is the head of environmental cooperation for peacebuilding program for UN Environment. Before we get started, David, would you like to say a little bit about your work and how you came to this area?
Thanks, Carl. I came to this area many years ago. We first started inside of UNEP to look at the environmental impacts of conflict, and we were focusing really on how violence and armed conflict damages natural resources and what the knock-on effects were for human health and human livelihoods. So we spent many years looking really at the downstream impact of conflict on natural resources. And it became evident after talking with many people on the ground, many communities, that in fact, natural resources were also driving conflicts and financing conflicts, and that we should really be looking at that side of the equation, but also that natural resources can really bring communities together through shared management and cooperation, and that we should be looking at that side as well. So we basically, fanned out, expanded the scope of our operation from a narrow focus on impact assessment to also looking at drivers, and then also looking at opportunities. So it came very organically, very much from the field, from what we were seeing, and from an attempt to really tackle this issue in a very comprehensive and systematic way.
And how did you personally get started in this?
I mean, my initial background is in geography and biology, and I was initially very much interested in looking at biodiversity corridors and resolving conflicts between different land use groups, and in many ways, use that background inside a fragile state context. Again, looking at how natural resources and land use plans can capitalize on opportunities, but also deal with potential conflicts over those resources. So certainly my background wasn't directly looking at environment and security and hard security and violence and peace, but I had the formation of integrated land use planning, stakeholder conflict resolution, and various aspects of that.
Excellent. So I have a few pre-submitted questions, and we'll start with those. For those that are on the call or on the office hour right now, if you have questions, if you have comments, please submit them in the comments section, and we will try to answer as many of your questions in the hour that we have. I'd like to maybe start, David, with a question of post-conflict. There's a question about what does the word post-conflict mean? How do you know when you're in that phase?
And you want me to start off with that question?
Yes, please.
I mean, there's a few different ways to define it. It's a bit of an inaccurate term because very few places are permanently in a post-conflict kind of context. They ebb and flow very much, and you also have situations where you have sort of a post-conflict setting, but within that setting, there are geographic areas still very much in conflict. So it's a bit of a complicated concept, but we typically use two different definitions. The first is a situation where you have a peace agreement between parties, and where you get a request for the UN to engage typically a peacekeeping mission, and then typically some kind of recovery or peace building program. So that's typically what launches our work, is either a peace agreement or the deployment of a peacekeeping force and a request to start developing a recovery program and a peace building program, and an explicit request to look at natural resources and environmental issues. So that's basically how we look at it. Carl, what do you want to add to that?
Well, I think that you've got the start. I think the question is, when does it end? When, ideally, if it goes back to conflict or if it goes back to sustained conflict. But for a country like Sierra Leone or Liberia or Guatemala, at what point can one say that you've gone from the post-conflict period to a regular development or sustainable development period? Often there are no markers, but are there qualitative measures, or how do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, it's all about the level of governance and the ability of institutions to take forward policies, implement laws, and deal with stakeholder conflicts over natural resources. And so I'd say the moment, or where you, it's not a moment, it's very much transitional, but once you have a legal and policy framework in place, once you have basic institutional capacity to implement that framework, and once you have the ability to resolve stakeholder conflicts, and where the institution is trusted to do that, you can basically start, the international community can basically start, in a sense, withdrawing support and really transitioning to a national or local level governance process. But it does take a long time. It takes, I would argue, 5 to 10 years to build up the legal framework, the policy framework, the capacity, and the trust. And it's very much, as I said before, with the same question in terms of when does, post-conflict start, it can be very much localized as well. And some regions can have capacity to resolve stakeholder conflicts way before others. So it's usually a bit of a patchwork. You have sort of the national level, the policy and legal framework, and then you have a patchwork of capacity at a local level to take forward that framework, to implement it, and to resolve conflicts. So yeah, it's for me, it's basically that's a core element of it, is that governance setting and institutional setting. I guess the other element would be looking at the livelihood lens, and when do you have livelihoods that are approaching sustainable livelihoods, or where you see maladaptive livelihoods moving towards more sustainable livelihoods. When you can start seeing that shift, and when you can determine that the livelihood foundation based on natural resources is moving in a sustainable direction, I think that's another good indicator of this context.
For those who are watching, this is a question David and I have wrestled with for a while. I think it's interesting because I feel like my take on it has evolved over time. For a while, we knew roughly when it started. That often was fairly clear. The localized questions aside, the question of when it ends, for me, for a long time, it was when the narrative shifts from a conflict narrative to the usual questions that face societies in development and social development, economic development, and that everything's not seen through the conflict lens. But I feel like while that's true, I feel like the work that is happening on environmental peace building is kind of stretching how these things get applied. And this kind of goes to the question, we talk about what's post-conflict. What do we mean by conflict? And there are a lot of people out there who focus on armed conflict and violent conflict, and that's, I think, where a lot of my own work has been, and I think that's true of yours, David. But there are also a lot of people that use this framework for social conflicts.
Sure.
And social conflicts can be any disagreement. It doesn't need to be violent, doesn't need to be a riot. And so there's this question of, how do you separate environmental peace building from environmental governance? Or are these coterminous? Are they synonyms?
It's a great question. And I think, again, the big indicator for me is, what do stakeholders trust? Stakeholders in the natural resource sector who do they trust? Do they trust local or national institutions to resolve a conflict and to help set a policy framework, or is the trust so low that an international actor is often needed? And how do you know, how do you know when you're needed, and more importantly, how do you know when to withdraw? And it's a critical question that speaks to both environmental governance and environmental peace building, is that question of trust. And ultimately, peace building has to be driven by local and national actors. There's no question about that. International actors can provide, convening. They can provide a way of balancing interest and power. But I think importantly, they provide that trusted broker element. And at what point can that be removed without those processes breaking down? And that's kind of the critical question. And that's obviously going to depend on all kinds of factors. But yeah, that's what we look at, is when can that support be withdrawn without those processes falling apart.
Your environment program has done a lot of work in country to build capacity. Afghanistan, Haiti, DRC, Sudan, South Sudan. What have you learned in that process about how to do it and how not to do it?
That's a great question. I think the main lesson is that capacity building has to encompass four realms. There's the actual technical capacity of managing natural resources, the actual the actual scientific and physical management of those natural resources, and the harvest rates and how to manage them sustainably. So you've got the technical realm. The second realm is this question of how do you govern those resources and how do you involve stakeholders in participatory decisions around them. You then have a third element, which is all about livelihoods and incentives to use those resources sustainably. And then there's a fourth element, which is all about social capital and social relationships. And how do you ensure that the social relationships are strengthening, the trust is building, and that different stakeholders can actually, as I said, resolve conflicts around those stakeholders. So building capacity is really not, a lot of people think about it just in terms of that technical component. If you're a forester or water management or climate expert, you're always thinking about the technical component, but in fact, it's almost an equal distribution of effort between the technical, the political, the social, and the the resilience and the social resilience side of it. So that's how we go about it, is looking at it from more that more holistic perspective, and making sure that there's a balance between those four elements. What about you? You've done a lot of capacity building in your time, Carl. What are your core lessons from it?
I think the biggest one for me is sustaining the effort. That often we're funded. We live on soft money. You do what you can do with the money you're given, and if you have money to do a training of customs officers or judges or park rangers, you do one training. If you're able to sustain that and do it time and again, you can be transformational. But you don't always have that money. You don't always have that commitment. And so where you're able to structure something in a more sustained way, I find that has the greatest impact.
Right.
I also feel like, one thing we've seen at ELI is that judges tend to be the ones that are ignored. They're judges and parliamentarians. That there's a lot of emphasis on communities, a lot of emphasis on the government, that emphasis on private sector compliance. All of that's good. Until you get judges involved, though, often you'll find that it's hard to actually enforce the law, because it's enforcement against the private sector, enforcement against government. Judges don't want to create an environment that's hostile to business, but they see the violations, but they don't want to create it. They get caught in this, and cases languish. So we found that judges, training of judges is very important to this transition to the rule of law. And you talked a lot about that, getting the laws in place, the capacity built. And I think there's another element which is, it's linked to capacity, but it's distinct, and that's the political will.
Right.
I think that technically it's easier to do the technical side. Here's the law. We'll train you on this. But actually building the political will to implement, to enforce, to impose the transaction costs, that I think is where we are still trying to figure out how can we be more effective.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about when you were talking is the need to use capacity building as a vehicle for trust building and relationship building between different stakeholders. You can use training as a neutral environment to actually bring together different ministries. And we do this a lot. We'll bring together ministries that surprisingly don't actually talk to each other very often. So, environment with water, with energy, with mining, with planning, with finance. And we use the capacity building training context as a way to bring them together and actually meet each other and forge relationships, which is hard to do outside of that context.
Yeah.
So we use it strategically in terms of knitting together government ministries, but also then getting government ministries to talk to stakeholders, private sector stakeholders, media, communities, and it's a really powerful setting to bring people together that wouldn't normally necessarily come together in a neutral setting. They might come together in a charged setting, but not in a neutral setting. And so we really encourage, how do we use it strategically as a neutral place to bring people together and to forge relationships that can be taken out of that capacity building context. And we try to do this very much with our MOOC on environmental security and peace building. We were trying very much to use that as a space to bring 17,000 people together and to really encourage them to form relationships in the MOOC that they could take into the real world. We hammered that message over and over and over again, and it worked. I think we've seen a lot of people make connections in that context that they have taken into the real world, and that's really satisfying to see.
And I've found that a lot of the people who wind up joining the Environmental Peace Building Association come through the MOOC, that this is a way for them to continue to engage the different stakeholders through the. There's a specific question that somebody asked. What are the best practices to raise awareness among local and international organizations acting in emergency and humanitarian crises about the possible environmental impacts generated by their operations? So it's not so much about building capacity locally, but minding their own shop.
This is a great question. And what we have seen, and I'll be very frank, is that by the time you're actually in the field, it's really too late to begin flagging all the different risks. I mean, you can do it in the field, but you really have to do it already within their operational planning and their standard operating procedures. So they need to be thinking about these things before, as a humanitarian actor, they actually deploy. And so they're thinking about mitigation strategies as part of their deployment operations. Because if they haven't thought about it before they've deployed, raising it when they're in theater or in the humanitarian setting, it's very hard to reprioritize in real time once they're on the ground. So I think the first lesson is it's got to be baked into their standard operating practices, and it's got to be part of their operational planning right out of the gate. Now, once if that hasn't happened, it's still valuable to raise it. And typically for us, we raise it in two ways, either through the work of the Joint Environment Unit, which is basically a unit that can be deployed in a humanitarian context to assess acute risks, acute risks to human health and to humanitarian operations, and to then flag those risks to the humanitarian actors on the ground. And so we have a mechanism to do that through the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA. And that's a very effective mechanism, at least to raise awareness. Now, whether those actors can transform that awareness into mitigation action immediately is a bit is uneven, but at least they're aware of it. And the third thing we're trying to do is to deploy digital tools and really start using digital applications and mobile phone applications to send in environmental data into humanitarian operations and into the planning of different relief operations and camps. So we've connected with the Norwegian Refugee Council, the NRC, to develop a mobile app called the NEAT, the Nexus Environmental Assessment Tool. It's a mobile app that can basically help assess what are the potential environmental risks associated with a very specific camp, and how can those risks be mitigated immediately in terms of the setting up that camp. So we're trying to offer a mobile app, and we're trying to offer data in terms of the location of protected areas or the location of sensitive forests or waters that humanitarian actors can take into account when they're setting those camps up. And we're offering it the ability to compare different locations as well. If there's 10 different locations, which location would represent, the minimum environmental impact, and how can that impact then be mitigated? So I think there are multiple ways you can address this, but as I said, the key thing is getting it baked into the standard operating practices and making sure people are aware before they deploy about these risks and mitigation strategies. Carl, you've been involved with many of these actors. What have you seen?
Sorry, before answering that, I'm curious, does NEAT apply only to setting up, or does it also apply to the ongoing operation?
Right now, it's a tool for the setup, but we're trying to see how over time it could be a monitoring tool as well.
Okay.
But it provides an analysis of the baseline conditions and the potential risks, and then the outcomes should be used as that camp is designed and implemented. But at the moment, it doesn't provide sort of a monitoring framework over time to make sure that those risks were mitigated. But we'd like to see that in the future. Right now, it's getting it out, getting the app consolidated and getting it out into the hands of humanitarian actors and getting feedback on that first mission. And if that's accomplished, then we can look at another mission.
That point that you just made about proof of concept, I think that is really important to this, because I think there are ways that one can communicate with these actors that it's pretty easy to convince them that, yes, it's good to reduce your environmental impacts. You don't want to do harm. You don't want to generate conflicts with the host community. It's a security risk if you need to be shipping in water or fuel. So there are different arguments. The question is, how do you do it? And I think that, David, your point about, if you're getting to the field, that's too late, is spot on. This is something that starts with the policies. It starts with in-house capacity, a number of peacekeeping missions. So you have the policies, and I think what's interesting is that you do have some champions. The Swedes, I think the Norwegians, the US government, all have policies for reducing environmental impacts of their operations. And then you have units within the governments. And I have the sense that there's interest by other governments. So governments look at what others do, and right. So having these champions, I think, is important, and working with them and exploring how you can learn from what they've done, the approaches, because I think that it still needs to be then contextualized within the policy and operational framework of the other entities. Yep. I think that having the policy is important, having the kind of the resources on staff is important, and that applies both to kind of the learning and the home hive, if you will, the headquarters, as well as in the field. And I think that the peace-building missions, the peacekeeping missions have been pretty good about it started out on an ad hoc basis, somewhat irregularly. They'd appoint an environmental officer. It seems like that's become much more regularized.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I absolutely agree. Peacekeeping, I mean, I think the question was looking at the humanitarian setting, but if you look at a wider peacekeeping setting, yeah, the success there, it's very easy to track. I mean, they started with a policy, they adopted a policy at the top level. That policy then had to be translated into standard operating practices, which every mission had to adhere to and report against. It also translated into having an environmental advisor or an environmental expert in every mission to basically offer real-time advice and to basically collect data on compliance with the policy. And it also translated then into procurement and making sure that options were available for equipment that also had minimum environmental impact. So it all started with the policy framework and then trickles right down. As you say, though, it depends on having those resources available to then translate that policy into operational practice. I think the other thing, and you kind of touched on this, it's not only about focusing on the downstream impacts, but it's about thinking about how those impacts also then touch on the delivery of humanitarian service. So if you're creating impacts on groundwater, that eventually will circle around to being a threat to your own operation. So it's about thinking about the downstream and then how those downstream impacts affect your operations upstream and kind of making that loop. But it's also about thinking more about the environmental context in which these are being delivered and understanding the disaster context, the climate context, the general natural resource context, and how your operations fit into that context, and how that context will affect your operations, and then how your operations will affect that context.
Which I think this is leading to a couple of systemic questions that are coming in. I like that. That really suggests an adaptive management approach. That you need to see what's working, you need to see what you've undergauged or overgauged, and adjust accordingly.
Yeah, it's also about speaking in terms that that humanitarian actors care about, and frankly, if you're talking about threats to the delivery of their humanitarian operations, that speaks very loudly. If you talk about, you need to mitigate your environmental impact, that doesn't speak very loudly, frankly. But if you say, look, you need to think about what are the environmental risks that could undermine the delivery of successful humanitarian relief, they're listening. So it's also about thinking about, how do you make this relevant to them, because obviously they're interested in saving lives and livelihoods. That's kind of their core mandate. And many humanitarian actors would say that protecting environment and natural resources is kind of secondary. It's not about saving life and livelihoods, but if you transform it into how can the degradation of natural resources in the environment undermine your operations, then they take it more seriously. It speaks more directly to them.
Speaking of communication, there's a question from Annika Danko. How important do you believe tools such as nonviolent communication skills are when speaking with stakeholders?
Now, I guess my question would be, what would be a violent communication skill?
I think it's consciously nonviolent. So it's, are there ways of speaking in terms that are more oriented toward reducing tensions? Or if you talk to people who focus on peace building,
right,
they often have a much more gentle manner, I find.
Right.
Environmentalists or people working on natural resources, they're much more technical. And
Right.
sometimes that could be cold. Sometimes they can rely on the science and dismiss cultural aspects. But this, the consciously nonviolent communication or peace building oriented.
I would say that's absolutely fundamental. Everything, I would almost argue, everything hinges upon that skill set. I think this is probably one of the weaknesses of sort of technicians, environment and natural resource managers probably don't deploy nonviolent communication skills as effectively as they should. They come in it far too technically and don't necessarily understand that political context or the way of introducing these concepts that that doesn't actually create tension or conflict. So I do think it's actually fundamental. If the definition is consistent with what you said, Carl, I would fully agree that it's a core and probably something we're fairly weak at, or many actors in the environment natural resource sector are weak at. This is exactly why this is sort of what I was going back on capacity building. It's never at just a technical lens only. It's got to be a technical, a governance, a livelihood, and a relationship lens that you attack, that you tackle any of this with.
It is, Annika followed up to say that Marshall Rosenberg has written a lot about this style of communication. I think that one of the things that I have seen in our work on conflict sensitivity, because a lot of environmental peace building, we've focused on trying to convince other sectors, the security sector, the peace building sector, the humanitarian sector, that they need to be thinking about environment. I feel like at the same time, we need to be talking to our community about how do we better operate in these settings. Part of that's communication, part of it is the design of the project, the selection of the project, or the implementation, but it's simply because these approaches and this mode of communication worked in this one setting doesn't mean that it's going to work in this conflict-affected setting, or that
Totally.
it might have been tolerable in the other setting, but it's going to be intolerable here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the most essential elements is understanding, I would argue, the historical context and the political economy of the different stakeholders in a particular area. And I think this is where I'd say a lot of UN actors fail to basically, maybe not a lot, but many people fail to actually understand that historical context and the political relationships between the actors and the sort of the power dynamics. And they walk in with technical solutions which are not informed by that history, and that can be a huge recipe for failure. I think we had the UN Special Representative, the Secretary General for Liberia, on a panel one time, who basically said, his biggest failure as SRSG was failing to understand the historical context of the Liberian conflict. They didn't go back in time and really understand this dynamics. They just started at sort of the peace agreement and said, let's go forward without really looking back. So I think, yeah, it's essential. Understand that context and those relationships is really fundamental to environmental peace building.
I also feel like there's often failure may be too strong a word, but difficulty listening, that especially for people who come from hard charging communities, whether it's your country and you just move forward and you talk.
Yeah.
Sometimes it takes a while for this scene and the dynamics to unfold, and people are pushed in time. They're pushed without, you have to do all these things. You don't have the resources to do them, and so there's often a rush. And I think when you're rushed, it's hard to listen.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's absolutely, it's a question, again, it's a question of trust building and how long does it take to build trust, and it's a question of who's actually leading the process. Is it an international actor that is trying to lead, or is that actor simply trying to convene and supporting a local initiative that is really in charge? So where does the center of gravity lie in terms of taking the process forward, and what is the international actor doing versus the local group? And do they trust each other? I think that's an essential component to get right. And I think in many cases, international actors think that they're in charge and leading and doing all the heavy lifting, and they've got it wrong. They've inverted it. They should be convening and offering technical support, but ultimately it should be national or local stakeholders who are in charge and leading the process. And that's something that depends on a very long time frame. And I think the other challenge is that international actors, they work in projects, and they work in these very false modalities which don't connect to the ways communities manage natural resources. They're not managed by project and by log frames and outcomes. they're managed on a very daily basis and in a very organic way. So I think you have a disconnect between how local communities manage natural resources and how international actors engage through projects. There's this fundamental disconnect, and I think there's probably not enough attention paid to, how do we support local actors? How do we facilitate, provide that convening power, but really, as you say, listen, support, and help those actors take forward management solutions that are really led locally and not by the international actor.
So this is a wonderful transition to another question we have, a question from Kenneth Michael Beck. Quantification and assessment, specifically before armed conflict as it develops, then when can we quantify the enter or need to withdrawal in a given time frame? He said, the Good Judgment Project taught us not to trust just opinions, no matter how expert. Sorry. I'm not certain I entirely understand the question, but I think it's interesting because I feel like what you were saying just before the question, David, part of it is that people often get trapped in their log frames and their project, and when this is really a process, and you have the kind of the broad arc of what's happening in that particular context, and trying to support the groups coming together, listening, learning, building, finding common ground. But then you have the reality of the project where, okay, here's the time frame, here's the money, what is your process, and this question of trying to show impact and quantify in a situation that is at best mixed methods, at worst inherently qualitative.
Yeah, I think I think this is the biggest Achilles heel for I'd say the peace building world in general, and environmental peace building even more specifically, is that we don't yet have a good handle on the quantification of these dynamics and ways of measuring the impact of our interventions. And as you say, there's obviously a quantitative element to it and a qualitative element. And I think we're very still at the early phases, let's say, of getting those two, getting metrics around both of those, and then telling a story of impact that is convincing enough that the donors will continue funding and that the local stakeholders actually believe as well. And I think this is the next big frontier in environmental peace building, is exactly that, is getting those metrics in place so that we can look at those trends and understand the complexity in more detail. I don't think we'll get to the point where we can say quantitatively, this is where peace building starts, this is where peace building ends. But at least we need a general sense of the metrics and the trends. And it's always going to be a bit of a judgment call, but that judgment should be backed by some kind of data and a data-driven approach. And I think this is if I were going to focus the next 5 years on one issue, it would be exactly this issue.
And so just to be absolutely clear, it sounds like there are kind of two aspects to assessment, or there's the assessment before the activities are undertaken, and then there's the assessment that's undertaken as part of the monitoring and evaluation at the end. It sounds like both Kenneth and you are talking more about the upfront. How do you collect the data? How do you do the assessment to decide whether to intervene, to make decisions?
No, I think we're talking about both. We need to understand the baseline context, and we need to understand, we need much more emphasis in terms of predictive analytics of where the next big environmental security hotspots are. We need that element. We need a second element, which is how do we use data or big data to assess impacts during conflict, and how can we automate monitoring, environmental damage during a conflict. And we also need a much more data-driven approach for measuring and monitoring the impact of different interventions. So it's the whole cycle needs a much more rigorous, evidence-based, data-driven foundation, I think. And it's always going to be a mixed approach between qualitative and quantitative. It's about getting those metrics in place, agreeing on the big trends and sort of what's the narrative, what's the bigger narrative that takes into account those different data points. As I said, I think in the book project that we ran, Carl, we had 225 different contributors. One of the guidelines to the authors was show us your data. How do you know that your natural resource intervention is contributing to peace building? And Carl, how many data points did we actually get? Not many.
It was all qualitative,
Yeah,
with a couple of exceptions around peace agreements and such.
exactly. But generally speaking, it's thin on the quantitative side. So
Yeah.
I think it's the big challenge for this field, and as I said, for peace building more broadly, this is a huge challenge. And I think there's no longer, a lot of people would say that it was data data constrained for many decades, and I would agree with that. But I think nowadays, with all the technology available to monitor different types of data, that's no longer a major constraint. I think it's now like what are the data points that would convince us that peace is moving in the right direction, or that conflict is exacerbating. So it's agreeing about what those what are the indicators, and what are good trends, what are bad looking trends, and how do we interconnect different data points.
Do we have any examples of programming that has a much more data-driven approach? And I'm thinking, are they from situations that are as fluid as conflict-affected settings tend to be?
We tried to quantify the quality of stakeholder relationships in Sudan. This is one of the readings for the MOOC. And we looked at, I think it was 5 different relationship metrics, and we tried to judge, each metric was on a continuum, and we tried to judge whether or not the relationship was advancing in towards the positive end of the continuum or the negative end. So we've certainly tried to do it on the relationship side, but what we haven't yet been able to do is, again, look at those 4 elements that I mentioned: the resource management side, the governance side, the livelihood side, and the relationship side, put those together into a framework, and then tell a convincing story on that basis. So I think we've done it in a patchwork way, but it's still a lot of work to go to bring it to the level that I would like to see.
Kenneth Michael Beck says, MapX does with JSON, I guess.
MapX was an attempt to do it, at least an attempt to do it through spatial data, and to offer a framework to access best available spatial data, and to put that into some kind of dashboard and to monitor with that. But I would say that what it doesn't yet do is it doesn't provide a way to integrate that qualitative side. So it's a partial tool or a partial solution, but again, I don't think the community of environmental peace builders has seen a demonstration of best practice where you can knit all these different data points together and actually demonstrate what the trends are and if the project is having an impact or not.
With the example you were providing from Sudan, was that at the beginning and the end, or did you also do it kind of through the middle and adjust course accordingly?
No, it was baked into the project itself from the outset, and so we were using these different metrics to judge whether the relationships were improving, and by and large they were. There was a very successful project, and the different metrics definitely showed an increasing quality of the relationship between the stakeholder groups. So that was one important metric we were using, and I think that's one of those fundamental metrics that we need to be aware of. Are relationships moving in the right direction or not? But in that project, we didn't yet have the resources to then link it to, is the physical quality of the natural resource we were managing improving? What's going on in the institutional setting? And how are the livelihoods changing? So I guess one of the problems is that the actual data requirements are large, frankly, and a lot of projects don't have the bandwidth or funding to look at and collect rigorous data for the different metrics you want to look at. And we haven't yet found a proxy or a quick and dirty way of doing that.
It seems like there are some efforts underway, not necessarily in the conflict context, but I've seen them elsewhere trying to integrate the natural resource data sets, the governance data sets, the interventions, whether this is around the Belt and Road Initiative or around other specific contexts, but starting to try to, and part of it's also getting the governance data into a consistent format across enough states that you can, that they're not always reinventing your database.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges here is you're trying to deal with spatial data in terms of natural resource distribution, distribution of conflicts, etc., with, in a sense, spatial data like governance quality, which is very hard to map, and social resilience, and social relationships. Those vary across time and space, but they're really hard to capture. If you compare it to capturing the physical environment and changes in the physical environment. So you're dealing with phenomenon that are of a very different nature, and hard to analyze and hard to represent in a spatial context. So yeah, I think it's a huge challenge, and it's definitely one of our priorities to get it right. And anybody that can show me good examples or good templates of where this has been done in other contexts, I'd be very keen to see those and see how we could apply some of that learning.
So ELI, as you know, has been working with the law division of UNEP on the environmental rule of law. And part of that has been trying to develop indicators and methodologies for assessing whether, how strong is the environmental rule of law in a particular country. Now, this is really focusing not on, do you have this law or this institution? It's a question of, is the country implementing the law? Does the environmental law have the practical force of law in that country? And it's really hard to get data on this.
Yeah.
That there are some organizations like Transparency International for corruption. They don't measure corruption; they measure perceptions of corruption.
Right.
And okay, that's better than nothing. It is a metric, but it'd be nice to have more objective measures. It's interesting to think about whether there are, I don't know if you want to say inherent limitations, but practical limitations that, and what does that mean for our ability to have data-driven programming?
I think there are, and like you say, let's just say something like dispute resolution capacity, right? That's going to vary very much across a country. And some places will have the capacity to resolve local disputes and there'll be trust and whatnot. And in many places there won't be. But getting that kind of fine-grained detail is extremely difficult. And I think you're right. We need to have a conversation with countries, with donors to say what does success look like, to you? What are the metrics that would be successful or that indicate success? How much are you willing to pay for those metrics, and how do we find a balance, in terms of collecting, an adequate amount, a minimum adequate amount of data that will give us the metrics that will convince you that we're having an impact, and then work back from there. So yeah, figure out what that final narrative looks like, what the final qualitative and quantitative indicators are, what it'll cost to collect that, and kind of work back then to how do we collect those data points. And you're right. I think there are inherent limitations, and we need to accept those and figure out, an approach going forward which takes those into account, which still gives us an indicative picture of the trends.
I'd like to shift gears for a moment. You've mentioned a couple of technologies in this call, MapX and big data. Are there other technologies that you think people should be alert to when it comes to environmental peace building?
Well, I think more and more we need to be, again, one of these indicators is if a particular country is active in a social platform, whether it's Twitter or Facebook or another platform, can we use that as a data point to see where there's growing social conflict or social tension, where there's mistrust in government, or where there are different local priorities to manage different natural resources? Can we extract data through natural language processing and AI to really map what the big issues are at a national scale very quickly to get an indicative feel? So I think definitely, how do we tap into that kind of big data from the different social platforms to get a sense of priorities? That's definitely one. I think the other, again, it goes back to mobile phones. How can we crowdsource information about, let's say, environmental damage during a conflict? How could we set up an automated monitoring platform to determine where there may be an environmental impact, and then send a request down to somebody with a mobile phone to say, please go collect some photographs and try to verify that this particular natural resource has been damaged, and then perhaps even pay for that, pay for them to upload that data. So how do we use crowdsourcing and mobile phones as a data collection tool or a verification tool for environmental impacts, and how do we then pay for that service, or pay for that end user to actually give us that data? And this goes to more broadly, environmental restoration itself. At the moment, big restoration projects are managed typically by an international actor or a local NGO. But is there a way to shortcut that and go directly to communities to restore different natural resources, and then get paid directly through a mobile app to do that? So how can we push more funding directly to local actors and put them, immediately in charge of restoration programs, using different technologies and tools to verify their work and to get paid for their work?
We have about 7 minutes left, and I'd like to close maybe looking forward. You've been at the center or associated with many of the most significant issues around environment, conflict, and peace over the last 20 years. It's scary to think about that. I'm rounding a little, but not much.
Yeah, you're rounding a bit.
But it's amazing what you have done. Where do we go from here?
That's a great question. Well, I think I've already answered part of that, and part of that is leveraging technology and finding environmental peace building 4.0 in many ways. I still think we're not deploying this full range of technology we could be to be monitoring these dynamics. So as I said, I think we need to be sort of focusing on 3 areas. One is the prediction of environmental hotspots and places where natural resources are degrading and creating social tension. So we need to be predicting where these are, or identifying where these are, and predicting in advance where they're coming, and especially looking at the combination of environmental degradation and climate change, and then deploying much more proactively interventions. So that's number one. We need to be monitoring conflicts in real time and looking at where there is direct and indirect damage, and using AI to detect that damage, and then trying to source verification to the crowd. And then the third, as I said already, is looking at impact monitoring, and how do we use different technologies to actually monitor the impact of our interventions and show that natural resources are actually contributing to localized peace building. So I think there's these three priorities from my side. I think the other is looking at the work of the International Law Commission, and how do we take these principles forward, and how do we get much more traction around them and get them implemented. And maybe that's something that you can speak to, because as much as I have been involved in this world, you have been co-leading every step of the way and really pushing the envelope, especially on the legal side and the normative side. And I would argue any success I've had has been typically leveraging your success and the success of many other people in this field. So this has certainly been a team effort all the way, and I'm often just piggybacking on the ideas and the work of many others, and trying to use whatever convening power the UN has, or whatever legitimacy the UN has, to take many of those ideas forward. But maybe, Carl, why don't you speak a little bit about the ILC work and the potential that holds for also transforming the field.
So David's referring to work of the International Law Commission, which is a UN body of legal experts from around the world that progressively develops and codifies the development of international law. And over the last 6 years or so, the ILC has focused on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. And it's been looking at what international law currently exists on protection of the environment. And the important thing here is in relation to. That historically there's been a focus on protecting the environment during armed conflict, and that's been almost largely looking at international humanitarian law or the law of war. But the framing of the ILC allows us to look across the conflict life cycle, before, during, and after. It also allows for more messy situations, the things that David was talking about at the beginning, where this part of the country might be stable, this part is still hot. But I think they've looked at across the conflict life cycle. And the other really important development is that it's not just about international humanitarian law. It's integrating these different norms from international environmental law, international criminal law, international human rights law, and that gives a lot more detail to the protections. There's still a question about, in a particular circumstance, which bodies of law are applying and how. Is it the same when it's international or non-international armed conflict? There are questions that really are important to analyze, but the International Law Commission has developed this series of principles, and those principles were provisionally adopted, and now there's a year-long consultation process. Those will be finalized, expected sometime early to mid next year. And at that point, the work really is in popularizing these, getting this articulation of what is allowed, what is prohibited, what is obligatory into the military manuals for different countries, into the NATO guidelines, into the peacekeeping guidelines. So there's a question of how to operationalize this. Is there training that's needed around them? I think there's also a question about where, are there gaps in the principles as they stand? And I think there will be plenty of fodder for people who are looking for theses and dissertation topics. But I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this is the most important legal development since probably since Additional Protocol 1 and the Environmental Modification Convention from 76 and 77. The only thing that might rival it is the UN Compensation Commission's work actually adjudicating claims against Iraq. But it's been a fairly quiet process, but it is it's going to have a huge impact as we talk about the normative framework for protecting the environment in relation to armed conflict.
And maybe, Carl, I think the one thing that the one big success in framing this was looking at before, during, and after. I think that was a huge step forward, and it really helped to sort of cement this understanding the conflict life cycle and how natural resources contribute to, are damaged by, and or support peace building. I was so happy to see that they took that approach and really fanned out the focus to that before, during, and after context.
And I completely agree. That is one of those framing questions that it's easier for us to talk about looking across the conflict life cycle when the International Law Commission says law protects the environment across the conflict life cycle.
Right. And Carl, maybe I can ask a cheeky question. What was your sense? I mean, if I remember correctly, they didn't ever actually define environment. They've left it open.
Yes, and the difficulty is that in international humanitarian law, you have protection of the natural environment. And but other bodies of law don't focus only on the natural environment. And the example here, I think that it's interesting to think about is targeting of water infrastructure. Water infrastructure like pipes, distribution networks. This is the built environment. The water in it is the natural environment. And
Right.
so I think there is a question. I think the ILC is still debating how exactly to manage those distinctions. I think that's something that is being looked at in this year of consultations. One of the things that I think this does show also is that definitional questions are often it's a swamp, and you can get sucked into it. And often it's easier to say, okay, let's, what are the norms we can agree on, and then we'll argue later about how it's applied to this particular context. Is it the environment? Is it a conflict? But we agree on the broad norms.
Right. Yeah. One solution may be just not to define it, right? Just to leave the word and allow that definition to emerge almost from the application.
Constructive ambiguity, I think, is what Kissinger called it.
Exactly.
And I also want to acknowledge the profound work that both Marie Jacobson and Maria Leto have done in this area. They've put in a lot of work, consulted a lot of people, and really pushed the reports and the principles through the process. And there were so many ways it could have met an untimely demise, and the fact that it is where it is a testament to their leadership and their effort.
Yeah, absolutely. As you say, they took an ambitious approach. They're visionary in their framing. They really led with a huge amount of ambition and passion and conviction, and the outcome is evident. It's, as you say, it could have hit a wall at many different points, and the fact that it didn't attests to their not only their leadership but also their political skills, and keeping everybody engaged and supportive.
Okay, I think we have come, speaking of walls, we've hit ours, and I want to thank you for your time, David, and thank people for their questions and comments. It's been a rich process, and with that, we will close. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. It's always a pleasure, and good luck with the rest of the course.